Hello, everyone. Welcome back to StatTech Research's seminar series on measuring progress and well-being. I am Kelsey O'Connor, one of the organizers. Today, we are pleased to welcome Beth Allgood, who will discuss the wild happiness approach to wildlife conservation. Beth will speak for around 40 minutes and then address questions at the end. At that time, please raise your virtual hands or post your questions in the chat. During the presentation, please keep your microphones muted. And a last reminder, we are recording the event. You'll be able to find this and past recordings on our website and YouTube channel. Now to introduce Beth Allgood. Beth is founder and president of OneNature, which is a nonprofit whose mission is to ensure inclusive well-being for all beings. She has more than 25 years of experience in conservation and community development. And in order to create more sustainable outcomes for people and wildlife, she's developed approaches to measure and support community well-being in biodiversity and climate work. Beth is a consultant and advisor to several organizations and a member of 3 International Union for the Conservation of Nature commissions. And she was recently named one of the Explorer Club's 50 people changing the world needs to know about. Personally, I'm looking forward to learning more about her hands-on experience in conservation and community development. Without further ado, I'm pleased to welcome Beth Allgood. Beth, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kelsey, and thank you so much for having me here. I'm really, really excited. I got to attend one of the StatTech seminars, I guess it was in 2021, and loved it. It was just really, really interesting. So I'm excited to, and actually I didn't get to present at that time, which would have been semi-similar because I COVID, which was a bummer. But anyway, new day, new presentation. So thank you all for joining. So I'm Beth, I'm the Executive Director of OneNature, and I'm really happy you decided to join us. I'm going to give a little background first about how I got into something that seems a little nichey. It is a little nichey, but there's a path, and I'm just going to go quickly through some of the ways that I got here. And many of you will be very familiar already with the idea of the flaws of GDP, but I first learned about it maybe about 15 years ago. And I was working on conservation policy work, different campaigns on an ivory ban to save elephants from poaching, online wildlife crime, endangered whales along the East Coast. And it all started to seem like it was just problems of more, like needing more profit, more development, more stuff. And the problem was not going to be solved by, say, ultimately by banning ivory, because there's always something else that's worth more. You know, if you ban ivory, then people will sell more rhino horn. Like as long as there's the pieces and the parts of wildlife are worth more than the lives of wildlife, we can't really solve these problems. So that it was sort of a realization I started to have, but I didn't know what to do with it. And then I had just had a baby and I was facing some very serious health issues. So I started thinking about well-being on a personal level with this kind of work stuff going on in the back of my head. And, you know, the sixth extinction crisis looming over us. And then I saw that, yeah, I learned about gross national happiness. I learned about Bhutan, and that you could actually emphasize the well-being of people over the growth of the economy. And I thought it was incredible. And then I started to think, okay, well, there's something here that can be applied to the field of conservation, to our work on the ground. And that's what ultimately led to this approach that I'm going to introduce, which integrates holistic and community perceptions of their own well-being into wildlife conservation efforts. So, it's not advancing, just a moment. There we go. Okay, so I went on, in my early days of exploring, I went on a walk that a friend of mine was taking from Vermont to California and back again to ask people what they thought about what mattered to them, basically. And I just was in Santa Fe, which was a very nice part of the walk, I have to say. But you know, she was with Gross National Happiness USA, and I joined that organization. I was president for a while, but she got answers that were similar, of course, to most of our answers: family, purpose, health, safety, nature. But our systems clearly weren't reflecting that common values that we all believe and prioritize. So I started to shift my policy work at that time with as much time as I could piece together, because I was running campaigns and doing other stuff. And I started researching the link between animals and human well-being, between nature and wildlife specifically and human well-being, so that I could bring that more into the well-being movement, the wildlife piece, and conservation efforts, the well-being piece. And so I just had this idea that there were ways this work could be better integrated, and it would help both kind of sectors of the work. So I presented it at a Gross National Happiness Conference in Bhutan. I went to several Conference of the Parties for the Convention on Biological Diversity, presented on Capitol Hill with some partners. And then I started collaborating with some really generous experts in well-being measurement field and community conservation practitioners. And we published several papers and reports on these values of nature and how we could begin to measure well-being in community conservation. These are all available on my website, which is OneNatureInstitute.org. We have a resources page, and they're all there. So then in 2020, during COVID, I left my job as a U.S. director at International Fund for Animal Welfare to start OneNature, because I was just obsessed and I had to learn more. So at OneNature, we measure and promote human well-being as a complement and alternative to purely economic and biological approaches to measuring project impact. So now that's all about me. That may have been too much, but I wanted to know I wanted you to know how I got to this kind of intersection. So, do we need a new approach for conservation? Well, I would say yes, and so do many, many people. I mentioned how well-being is important for individuals and governments like Bhutan and Luxembourg, of course, and others who are starting to create policies and promote it for their citizens. But these same concepts, approaches, and measurements can apply to work in communities and conservation and development. I mean, of course, conservation has had some successes, some really wonderful successes, but there are weaknesses in traditional conservation approaches that have almost always traditionally excluded communities from decision making. It's beginning to get better. But when you do that, you can get projects that communities don't want and don't sustain, projects that reflect what the project implementers think communities should want, but not necessarily how the communities feel. You can get human rights violations in extreme cases, and there have been plenty of reports of people basically punishing communities for their use of wildlife. And the extinction crisis continues to accelerate. So that's not great. And in a reflection of broader society, the success of traditional conservation efforts have been measured by economic metrics. Have they improved the economics of the people living in these places? And by ecological outcomes, which are obviously the reason most conservation organizations get into doing this work is for ecological outcomes. So how much land is preserved, how many species are protected. But again, these metrics exclude some pretty important voices, which are the people who live with the wildlife daily. When we do focus on the wildlife, when we do focus on the community, if we focus too narrowly on the livelihoods or economic outcomes, as I'm sure you know, we miss the broader dimensions of well-being, like spiritual connections to nature, cultural practices, mental health, all of these things that really matter to people's quality of life. So like the Beyond GDP movement, it's demonstrated that GDP alone is insufficient to measure societal well-being, and that rising subjective unhappiness can predict major societal upheavals more accurately than GDP. This is also true for communities. When subjective well-being is understood and supported, the resilience of communities in the face of environment and social change is increased. So obviously we need objective and these subjective well-being metrics. I'll get a little more into that. But there's also now, in this sort of anti-colonial, decolonizing conservation approach, this movement to center communities, especially Indigenous communities in decision-making. And everybody generally agrees that that seems like a good idea. Why wouldn't you want to do that? But implementation has really been missing some critical pieces like tools, like actual measurements, and it's also lacked an understanding of the importance and the value of a community's perceptions. A lot of people think still in this kind of old way that we're the experts, we come in, we're going to fix things, without understanding the fundamental reason why people make decisions in their communities for their own lives, and without necessarily appreciating the expertise of people about their own lives. So that's what this is all about. OneNature and our partner, the Happiness Alliance, set out to develop these tools and approaches. So I'm going to, I do apologize for this, but I wanted to show you all the questions that came out, and I have a much easier graphic that I could put up instead, but I'm going to go through a little bit of it. So let's just talk about it. The Wild Happiness Index itself is really a critical piece of the puzzle, and that combined with the steps of how you work with the community to understand and support well-being together, that's the whole picture. So we'll start with the index. So we measure how people feel about their lives through the Wild Happiness Index, which covers 12 domains of well-being, including life satisfaction, social support, and connections to wildlife. The Wild Happiness Index, we developed it in collaboration with the Happiness Alliance, and it's based on their happiness index, which is a scientifically validated survey and reflects happiness and generates results that can reflect quality of life in the areas that of the survey. So our survey relies heavily on that, some other research, and it's in papers on our resources page, but it also incorporates an element that speaks directly to conservation, which is how individuals feel wildlife impacts their well-being broadly, and how they feel that it impacts the collective well-being of the community, collectively. So it's peer-reviewed, data-driven, and it combines objective and subjective metrics. So I'll get into it a little bit more when I talk about the pilot that we did in Kenya, but that's the intro. So the approach, it's firmly based on this well-being baseline, establishing a well-being baseline, but there are some other steps. It's designed to be practical and to be applied and to be adaptable. So it's a 5-step process, and the first step is deep listening. So this is what I'm going to Rwanda to do in a couple days for this new project. It involves building relationships with communities, learning about their needs and values, what matters most to them. And I mean, it sounds really basic, like of course you would want to understand what matters to people, but honestly, this step is sometimes not implemented, let's just say it, in conservation and probably in lots of other types of work. So the second step is establishing the well-being baseline. Using the index that we talked about, we adapt it based on what we learned in deep listening, and we train the local data collectors to collect the information in the local language. We have scaled questions, generally 1 to 5, and opportunities for short answers to provide more insight into the scores. And so we rely on the experts, the community, to help us adapt it so it makes sense. It may exclude certain questions that are too sensitive, I have 2 surveys coming up where the trust in government questions are very, very sensitive and maybe counterproductive to get what the community and the partner on the ground need to work on the projects that they're doing. It's designed to support them. So even though it's based on this, best available research, the information is really just designed for use by the community. It's not necessarily to be published or shared more broadly. It's all anonymous, of course. So then we make sense of the data, which is step 3. So we take the findings from that Wild Happiness Index, analyze them, present them back to the community in a way that is digestible and meaningful. So it's not extractive, right? They need to know their results. They need to, we're not just taking data from them. We're trying to make sense of it, analyze it, give it back to them, and together make sense of it. So, for example, let's see, I had an example. Well, we work with a local conservation partner in every case and the community to interpret the results. And they have to understand the data and really help us understand their lived experience so that they can identify priorities and evaluate potential trade-offs for different project activities. And I'll, again, give an example with Kenya. Then we use that conversation and that the sense we've all made of the information to co-design projects and indicators. So we want to design conservation strategies that meet the conservation goals, but reflect the community's well-being priorities. It's very participatory planning, and it reflects local knowledge and values and fosters ownership and ultimately long-term success. So they need to decide what constitutes success for them, right? And what benefits matter to them the most, and how we're going to measure that. So that might be different than anything a conservation organization has ever measured before. There might need to be some help with that, but that's a really important step. And then finally, throughout the life of the project, we will continuously, well-being doesn't generally, we're not going to do this entire survey every year, but every several years, every 2, 3, come back and evaluate the well-being data and make necessary adjustments. So just to make sure that the project stays relevant and community-centered. And especially important is to make sure that we're aware of any early warning signs of conflict or dissatisfaction. There was an example, not where I was, in Kenya, of a Maasai community who burned down a lodge. And it came as a complete shock to the people who were running the lodge, because they thought they were doing benefit sharing, and they had no idea that this discontent was happening. There was an economic, some sharing of the economic benefits, but this is a perfect example of where understanding well-being and general levels of life satisfaction could have been a really important early warning sign to fix the problems and to make them work, right? To make the project work. Okay, so I'm going to get a little more into an example. Last summer of 2023, I had to check that 3 times because I swear this seems like it was a decade ago, but it was just last year. We led a Wild Happiness pilot in collaboration with IFAW, International Fund for Animal Welfare, where I worked for 12 years, in Kenya's Amboseli region. And our goal was to just understand a well-being baseline, establish that with the Maasai community, so we could figure out how IFAW could figure out how conservation efforts, especially species conservation, elephants, lions, other wildlife, impact their lives, and how they could improve their lives by protecting this wildlife. So we started with our deep listening. We had some community focus groups. We met with some leaders to ensure that the survey was culturally relevant. For example, there's a standard well-being question around generosity. How often do you give time or money to charity? So, I mean, clearly that is not relevant in the Maasai context in that way. So we adapted it to ask, how often do you give of your time? And then how often do you give of your resources to a member of your community? And then we also had to change the scale, because often that's like, once every 6 months, once a year. In the Maasai community, it's like multiple times a day. It's just a very different way of understanding generosity and reciprocity in this case. That's important to the community. So we trained the data collectors. They were Maasai data collectors from the community. They administered the survey in Maasai. This is a lot more challenging than it seems, because it's not just a language problem. Some of the concepts that are in traditional well-being measures globally are very Western, and they're a little bit hard to explain in order to even translate them. So we had a lot. This took a lot longer. Our 2-day training, a full day of it was going through each individual question and figuring out what does it really want to get at, and how can we ask it in a way that's understandable. So that's a tricky one. Okay, and then we got some results, and I'm going to move the chat and the thing so I can see them. Okay, so this OneNature and the Happiness Alliance analyzed the results and developed a very detailed report, and the findings were very interesting. I'm going to just explain what this is first. This scorecard shows the Maasai community respondents' answers in blue, and the Happiness Alliance global scores of all respondents who've taken their online survey in gray, just as to look at the differences. And there are no gray bars for community impacts and individual impacts of wildlife, because this was a pilot test. Those questions have never been asked before. I mean, at least in this way with this index. So that is why you just see a blue bar there. Okay, so a couple things. The average scores for life satisfaction, psychological well-being, social support, clearly significantly higher than global averages in the Happiness Alliance data, but also Gallup type data. So it's very interesting. The economy impact, I mean, the satisfaction with the economy was very low. And in this case, each of these is an average of several questions, except for satisfaction with life. And the economy questions, there were several. One of them is, how often do you go without food because you either can't access food or you don't have money to buy it? How satisfied are you with your economic resources, that kind of thing. And this score basically represented that the community was that the individual who was responding to this survey went without food twice a month on average. So it's interesting because obviously to have such high psychological well-being, satisfaction with life, even health, community domains, when you're actually unable to eat several times a month is really interesting. So I'll come back to that a little bit. I think one of the most interesting things is not purely as a research question, but as a question about how you're going to support food security in this community, where many types of interventions that you might make have the capacity to undermine psychological well-being, social support, community. If you increase, for example, economic inequality, then this reciprocity value is potentially undermined. People can start to hoard. There's all kinds of things that we've obviously seen. In addition, giving jobs to some and not, there's a lot of things that could be challenging in addressing food insecurity that would actually decrease satisfaction with life overall. So that is that's an example of one of the main reasons you would want to do something like this, because there's another organization that we found that has been doing a school feeding program in the community where the women make the food and bring it to the schools, which increases health and education outcomes and social support outcomes and maybe psychological well-being, who knows. It has the capacity to increase all of those things while also making sure people are eating. So anyway, I'm happy to answer some questions about that. I don't want to go into it too deeply if it's not interesting. But it's interesting too about the community impacts of wildlife and the individual impacts of wildlife, because they look like they're average, right? I mean, that's an average respondent score is middle of the road. They were actually quite extreme. There are a lot of people who were very high, loved wildlife. A lot of people very low, did not like wildlife. And we had a question about how the role that wildlife plays in the community well-being. And this was the word cloud that, that came out from that. And it was interesting that so many responses were economic. Not surprising, because you're part of a global economy. You need to have money to send your kids to school. The question was, though, how does wildlife impact your cultural practices? And there were less than a third that said they were very very bad. They just were negative. There's a lot of conflict. People die, crops are raided, you live with wildlife and that happens. And so it's not surprising that there would be some really negative feelings. But there were a lot of really interesting responses around, God gave us this land and this wildlife to steward. It's our responsibility. It's our honor. There were some around, for example, lions being important to culture. I'm going to bring this up because they're admired as a symbol of strength, and they're feared. And the skills and the expertise used in tracking and killing a lion was critical to the Maasai culture for generations. I mean, those skills were used in sort of a coming of age ceremony as a cohort to kill a lion, but they were also critical to being successful as a Maasai, working together, tracking, like doing all these things. And so you don't want to, and they're not allowed to kill lions anymore. There aren't that many lions left. Hunting them in Kenya is illegal. But you don't want to undermine that cultural connection by saying, okay, so you can't kill them. Don't view them that way anymore. We'll make sure you get money from tourism. When, we saw during COVID, tourism can stop. If you don't have a cultural connection to a important species like that can be challenging to live with, then with no economic incentive, are they suddenly worthless anymore? And I mean, it's a very concerning thing to me that we not try to replace a important cultural value with an economic value that can be precarious. So some projects, for example, have substituted other ways that still build on this relationship. So they have a Lion Guardians program where people become guardians of the lions in their community, and they use those same skills to see what's up with them, to do some scientific monitoring on them, to protect them. And that is an example, I think, of how knowing the importance to the culture and finding ways to support that is really, really important. Am I getting over time? How are we doing? Oh, okay. So I guess that's what I will say. There were well over a third of the responses that were really, we classified them as purely economic. So, all right, let's see. Well, basically, IFA is going to present this back to the community and co-create projects that address these community needs and priorities. So again, this food security particularly needs to be understood and addressed in a way that increases satisfaction, or at least doesn't diminish. I don't know how you can really increase life satisfaction very much from those numbers we just saw, but not diminish life satisfaction in the process. And then again, with these relationships with wildlife. So the real power is in tracking changes over time, in real time, as much as possible, and adapting. Okay, so future directions. The big and natural one is more projects, right? Understanding, learning what we learned from Kenya, and there were a lot of things that we learned, and applying them to new projects. So this, going to Rwanda in a couple days, working with a community and with an organization in Lao. So I'm not going there, but advising them. The Rwanda one's really interesting. I'm just going to briefly talk about it here because we're collaborating with an organization called Red Rocks Initiative for Sustainable Development, and they really do a lot around cultural, like having a cultural center and really supporting the cultural practices of these communities. And they live near Volcanoes National Park, which, you know, honestly, it's been a lifelong dream to go to Volcanoes National Park and see the mountain gorillas. The mountain gorilla population has increased dramatically from 400 individuals to over 1,000, but the park has to expand. So this community lives on the border of the park currently. There's some annual flooding, their houses get washed away. There's a lot of conflict with the agricultural production right at the park boundary, and they're expanding the park. So the community's moving to apartments relatively nearby. I'll know a lot more when I get there because I can't always tell how nearby it is, but it's a big life change. And this is not the only community. This is the first community that's going to go through this. So we want to be able to ensure that this move goes as smoothly as possible. They're going to have better access to water and sewage and lots of material things, but not to undermine overall satisfaction with life or feelings about the mountain gorillas. I mean, you know, one of the reasons mountain gorillas can thrive is because the communities protect them too. And so anyway, that is, it's a really important set of issues, and I'm really looking forward to learning more about it. And then we'll come back, we'll adapt the survey, and I'll train the data collectors while I'm there next week. Lao, it's a little bit different. We're working with the association Anulak to adapt the survey, the index, for a community near a park that relies on the forest for their livelihoods. They've been working there for 5 years, and the project is coming to a close. They're using the Wild Happiness Survey to understand both the current satisfaction with life and well-being across all the domains, and to try to get a retrospective of how people felt things have changed in the last 5 years. So what do they remember their satisfaction with life being 5 years ago? Just to sort of understand some of their project impacts, but also primarily to leave it in a state where they're supporting the community as much as possible moving forward while they're not able to stay there anymore. So we'll, in the spring, I'm very, very close to hoping that we'll be working on a snow leopard project in Nepal, which would be incredible. Okay, and then the other set of future directions is really using the principles to expand the approach a little bit. So this research, a lot of research with partners on the ground has shown that this relationship between cultural and spiritual, these non-material values that communities have for nature, can be a core foundation to conservation projects. Many projects are doing this already, but it is not sort of standard practice. And so, you know, I'll give an example, but so we've done some papers. We just did a chapter for a Routledge book on cultural ecosystem services, and had several case studies in there that emphasize this cultural and spiritual values of wildlife. For example, one of our partners in this research and in the case studies was working on snow leopards in Nepal, and in Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. And many local communities really view snow leopards as sacred guardians of the mountains. So it's like the lions. I mean, if you just had a tourism or economic value or no value for snow leopards, the fact that they prey on your livestock is a very serious problem, and you don't have really as much impetus to stop them. I mean, you just kill them, basically. Retaliatory killings are common of predators. We don't have that many predators in the United States anymore. But snow leopards are considered to be sacred guardians of the mountains in many cultures. And that means that if that can be supported and expanded in some way by connecting the youth to the elders who still hold this belief quite strongly. You know, there was a story in this case where an elder said that when they did, there was a time when they killed snow leopards and the mountains lost their echo. I mean, you don't want to make the mountains lose their echo. Like that sounds really bad, right? So telling those stories to the youth and supporting this connection is really important while you're addressing the causes of conflict. I mean, obviously, again, like the food insecurity issue, you have to make sure that these people have their livestock is not just it's their bank account, it's their food. I mean, it's very important. So you have to try to stop the predation. But anyway, valuing these non-material aspects alongside with economic and ecological metrics, you can help reinforce the cultural identity and the heritage of the communities too. It's not just for the wildlife, it's important to people. Second future direction is carbon. So we have a paper that basically applies this community well-being framework to carbon credit projects, which our carbon, I don't know how much you all follow this, but carbon offset schemes have faced really significant challenges of legitimacy for a couple of reasons, and one of them is community support. So we did this paper, which hasn't been published, but I did a Mongabay commentary about it in January, where we propose a new framework that measures holistic community well-being in carbon offset schemes, along with the other data that you collect for these sorts of projects. And we think that we can provide early warnings of dissatisfaction or emerging conflicts, as I mentioned, and it would strengthen the legitimacy of these carbon credits, and also align the projects with the long-term well-being of the communities. In many cases, communities have to give up access to lands that they previously had. These types of issues need to be really well understood from the perspective of the community, not just the people who are making the money on the offsets, right? Okay, wrapping up here. So we have this index and approach, and the flexibility means it can be adapted for different types of projects and different types of cultures. We have a little overview guide that we created with practical steps, and we have workshops that we can give people, organizations who are interested, or we can provide really specific guidance and our database for how to evaluate well-being. And I can't see the people, but I think someone from Columbia University might be here. But I just wanted to mention that we're currently working with the Columbia University Masters in Sustainability capstone project to review our indicators and approach, along with indicators and approaches from other conservation practitioners and new research, and other organizations' approaches to measuring well-being to deepen and to deep community engagement. So by the end of this semester, by December, we know that they will have recommendations that we think will be useful for us for sure, but for policymakers, for funders, for other practitioners, to see that that it can be practically applied and where those sort of best practice elements are. So yeah, thank you for sticking through it this long, and I would love to answer any questions or have any discussion. I have one more slide with all my info. Oh, that one. So I'm gonna stop sharing, and then is that all right, Kelsey?
Yep. Thank you very
Okay.
much, Beth. Excuse me. Thank you very much. Very well in time. So for those of you who have questions, please feel free to raise your virtual hand, or you can write in the chat. And I think I may start off with a question to better understand the benefits of the approach. So as you'll know, I love surveys. But part of what I understand is there's a discussion that's happening with the community in the process. One of the things you said is, with the snow leopards, there's stories to the youth while addressing conflicts. And so there's an exchange that's happening. And so what's the benefit of the survey? And I have some ideas in my head, but is there a significant benefit of the survey over just having discussions with the community while undertaking, significant changes?
Well, that's a great question. I think there is. I think for a couple reasons. One is people like numbers, they like data, they like to see how it changes over time. And it can provide a little bit more, well, two things. It can provide a little bit more focus on things that are changing, why they might be changing over time, and what you might be missing. And then it zeroes in on the types of conversations you really want to have, But the reason that really I started this project in the first place was because I did some analysis on kind of best practices in conservation using gross national happiness and saying, okay, do projects actually employ these broad well-being types of approaches generally, and how do they get there and how do they do it and that kind of stuff? And what I found was that in the cases, there were 12 that in this initial paper, that people, if they were from the community and then say went out and got some conservation degree or something and came back in, they could do this sort of deep community engagement along the things that are important culturally from the perspective of a community member, right? And then the and they wouldn't need a survey necessarily to do that because they're embedded in the culture, right? The other group of people who seemed to be quite successful were people who basically cared what the community had to say and were interested in things that may not be their own personal priorities, there are lots of people like that, but not everybody's like that. And so the idea initially was like, okay, best practice and well-being measure, there's an entire field for this. Like we've learned something about what matters to people that isn't culturally specific, that can get us out of our own biases, that can say, okay, well, we're going to ask questions about trust in neighbors because it matters. And if I, came from here to Rwanda and trust in neighbors never crossed my mind, I would never ask about it and I would never know how they felt about it. So it's more of a tool, a two-part tool. One is to get us out of our own biases and say, okay, these are things that are generally understood to be very important to people's well-being. How do they apply here? And they may need some tweaking, but how can they apply here? And so we're not just saying what we think. And then the other one is that there is a sense of saying, okay, satisfaction with life is extraordinarily high. What is that? What can we learn about that? If we hadn't asked the question, we wouldn't know. And if they were just saying, short answer questions or qualitative questions, we could learn a lot. But this can help zero in on some. They're just indicators, right? But they can help zero in on some really important elements that I think are important.
Excuse me, that makes sense. I also had the idea that frequently the discussion is between, let's say, leaders, and maybe you have introverted people or young people who don't feel capable of speaking up, in the context of everyone else. And so the survey may be more democratic, and you may get more honest results from that.
Yeah, also really, really important point, thank you, is that focus groups and things like that to discuss the results are often necessary because we can disaggregate by gender, by age, and there are some risks in doing that, like particularly in a very male dominated, older men dominated society, hearing that women aren't as satisfied. I mean, you just have to really be careful how you present this data and this information, and how you discuss it in a way that people can feel comfortable discussing it. So, in the IFA cases it was a household survey, and it was for heads of household, both male and female. There were equal men and women, but it was still heads of household, which is a different response potentially than you might get from the 20-somethings who are really struggling to, get an education or whatever. I mean, like, they're just different issues, and I think my approach moving forward, as much as possible, and it depends on the partner, like what they're comfortable with. If that's what they want to do, that gives them more information than they had before. But I think the best information would be really well documented and stratified sorts of segments of community who don't normally get to speak.
I had a question related to the context, specifically with the Maasai. And I'm going to continue with questions, but please, if anybody wants to ask a question, you can feel free to unmute yourself. Actually, Francesco, you can go next. Let me mute myself.
But if you want, if your question is pressing, I can wait. Okay. So yeah, great. Thanks a lot, Beth. A lot of interesting food for thought in your presentation. And actually, I don't know where to start from, so I will go in random order. The first one is perhaps the most fundamental one, is that basically you have been developing a bottom-up approach on what it is that determines, that constitutes well-being in the global south, because you've been working in Africa, you've been working in Asia. And I wonder, what have you learned about what is or that matters for progress in coming from these experiences? A related question, we're talking about poor communities, and we tend to believe that these are those that should put more emphasis on material concerns for their well-being. Yet it seems to me they're much more aware of the importance of the environment, of natural resources, than we would actually say. Would you like to elaborate more on what is that matters for well-being and what is progress for these communities?
Oh, well, that's a great question, and I do not know the answer. I can tell you what I learned in the Maasai community. I can tell you what I've learned from more of the kind of case study data. It's not data collection. I mean, I guess it is. It's case study collections, and that have been really, really interesting around I have a friend in Zimbabwe. I'm just going to give this example. I have a friend in Zimbabwe. He grew up in Zimbabwe. Totem animals were sort of one of the things that society was constructed around. So each family had a totem. It regulated some things like who you could marry, who you couldn't marry, how you would never like kill your totem animal, as I understand it. I'm no expert, so I probably should not have brought the story up, but you also wouldn't overexploit your neighbor's totem animal, right? I mean, that wouldn't be very neighborly or community oriented. So it was like a way of orienting society that lived in the forest in a way that was sustainable with the forest. And I find that very, very interesting. Now, of course, the global economy is almost everywhere. There's like there are very few untouched communities left. So even these communities that may have traditionally thought that have to compete in a global economy. So they have to pay school fees. They have to get health care. I mean, these are realities, and they don't live the way they did 50 to 100 years ago in this community. He took his son back who just graduated from college, and they don't talk about totem animals anymore. And the parents, like my friend's generation, they're like, look, we have to give our kids the skills they need to communicate, I mean, to compete or to live basically in a global economy. They need to focus on education, and they need to focus on, skills that will get them jobs. Meanwhile, the elders are still in there saying, but look, like, we have a responsibility to this forest, like, and it's meaningful, and it gave us meaning, cultural meaning. And they're dying. I mean, they're old, right? And so I feel like this is happening. It's an example, but things like this are happening in many traditional societies all over the world. The pressure between sticking with your kind of traditional approaches and culture versus a new economy culture, they're competing. And what I would love to see is that they not compete, but they combine, because we have things to learn. I mean, like, meaning me in my office in Washington, D.C., something's missing from a lot of our lives that I think some of these communities can help us with. And so it's not a one-way thing. We're going to help you save your wildlife. It's like, what has helped you save your wildlife for the past 50 years or 100 years or millennia? And maybe can we learn something about it? And to me, that cultural spiritual connection, even in light of challenges, while we're working on the challenges and still having enough food to eat, is a way that we can move forward in a more ultimately sustainable way for the planet and our happiness, because nobody's got it right now, right? Like, we're unhappy and unsustainable. So being sustainable may help, and being happy may help. Let's see if there's a way to bring all these things together. Does that make sense? And in terms of what I've learned overall about this, I don't think there's one thing. I mean, I think with the Maasai, they have a very strong cultural identity. The groups, where I worked, I think one of the reasons their satisfaction with life was so high is because they were answering the question as a Maasai, where their identity is a very large part of their satisfaction. Now, I don't know that because we haven't had a chance to ask, but I would be very curious about that. I don't think that's the same in Rwanda. I mean, Rwanda has had many, many, many problems, especially around identity issues. So we're going to be very cautious about how we ask questions about cultural identity. But I think generally it's a little bit different, but there are cultural activities from, music that's based on relationship with the forest to, to crafts that rely on forest products that are really important and aren't just for show. Like, the people want to do them because they mean something to them, and tourists can come and look at them, but it's not only for them, the way I think some indigenous tourist operations can be. They can seem exploitative and not like, well, we're really just supporting something these people value. And that's, again, where I think the important part comes. It's the same activity, but how the community feels about that activity, supporting, bringing tourists to see drumming versus bringing people to dance at the lodge. Like, the same thing, same money, but there's something different about it to me. And I think that's where we really need to delve a little deeper.
Sorry if I continue. I would like to leave the floor to others, but before I do, um, just to insist on this, is it just us from the global north who are obsessed by this idea of progress, or they also have an idea of progress, and what is progress for them?
Well, again, I think that's a generational difference. And I think that one thing that we as the West have done very efficiently is to share our idea of progress with everybody and make it their idea of progress. So I don't know. I think that is something I think there's a movement, like I said, to decolonize conservation and to really get more understanding of the indigenous values, the local values. I don't think we know the answer yet, because I think, and this is just not based on research, but my idea is, if we put as much effort into bringing people into the global economy value of progress, now going back and saying, okay, you know what, this is just as important. We missed it before. We're really sorry. We value this. We hope you value this. We want to like support you in valuing this, that there might be a way to save the some of these cultures that are dying out, basically because they've adopted the idea of progress that we have. Does that make sense? I think there's something there that I don't think you could say the global South has these values of progress versus ours. I think it's a very individual circumstance, but I think it's definitely a conflict between these values and some traditional values that I hope can be integrated more.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for asking.
So we're approaching 6 o'clock European time. Any last questions? I think I may have one last one, if it's okay with you, Beth. So I'm thinking about connecting with this in a very, very literal way, or a way in which I can visualize. So in the case of Rwanda, right? So they moved to these apartment buildings. Were they able to use insights from this work to improve that outcome? So let's say that access to nature, as an example, was determined to be really important. And then maybe they were able to change the structure of the apartment buildings in some way in order to assist them. And that's a very specific example, but what I'm ultimately thinking about is examples of how this work has changed an outcome for a community in the process of wildlife conservation. And the apartment was just one that we can speak to.
Yeah, no,
clearly.
I mean, the short answer is no, not yet, because the Kenya survey was only last year, and they haven't actually had the opportunity to share the results or shift their work yet. I think the apartment situation is a great example, though, because they haven't moved yet. And there's the opportunity to understand what challenges they face. Now, I don't know if the apartments are built yet. There might not be an opportunity to change the structure of the apartments, but maybe there's an opportunity to take the cultural center that my partner there has created and expand its use, or bring it to the apartment. Again, I'm also a little unclear about how much distance we're talking here,
Yeah.
but I'll know so much more in a week. But I think the idea is, yes, if they found that these cultural and social dimensions were really important to this community, that they could not be replicated or supported in the same way in an apartment building, then providing, well, like Bhutan, right? I mean, in Bhutan, they say that people have much better satisfaction about a lot of the material things, better access to education, better access to healthcare, better access to livelihoods. But trust in neighbors has diminished a little bit, and overall satisfaction with life has gone up, but not as much as you would expect. So I think knowing as a baseline and talking to the community about what they think they need can help mitigate those types of problems where you achieve all your program objectives. You move 15 families to an apartment, check. They have water, check. But how do they feel, and what do they need? Is my goal for how we would use this survey there. But I have to admit, it's early days, and I will hopefully be able to tell you more after that survey and after the move. And if we go back in 5 years, we've also never done a repeat survey, so to measure progress, and so that is the other big piece. Yeah.
So it sounds like we need to hear the results from the repeat survey sometime in the future. But
yeah, like 2 to 5 years in the future. Keep me on the calendar.
Sounds good. So any last burning comments, questions? Otherwise, Beth, you can give us the last few words and we'll close it here. So if you have anything else to add.
I would just thank you for the opportunity, for the work that you're doing and for the work that all of you do around measuring well-being and around, this type of work. I really believe the future is well-being and the future is sustainability and that this, all of the work that we're doing collectively helps to get us there, and that the alternative is not a great one. So our work is really
Yeah, perfect. Thank you very much. Have a
Thank you.
great afternoon. And to the rest
Okay.
of our attendees, thank you as well. I hope you have a great evening, afternoon, as the case may be.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.